Welcome, everyone. My name is Maureen Folk, and I'm the Outreach and Program Coordinator at the Chapman Museum in Glens Falls. This talk will cover the general history of Glens Falls through the years. I'm going to try and cover some of the major events and changes from the settlement of this area by Quakers all the way up to more recent changes. So much has happened in Glens Falls throughout its settlement, so not everything is going to get covered, but hopefully we can get the big stuff. So if we're going to be talking about the history of this region, it's important to acknowledge that Quaker settlers were not the first ones here. Native American tribes were hunting, traveling across, and living in this region for thousands of years prior to colonization. In this area, these tribes include the Mohawk, Mohican, and Abenaki primarily, but there were other tribes that no doubt trekked across this landscape. Now, we're not going to be discussing their history in this talk because I think it's worthy of its own talk in the future. The first colonizers to reach this area were Jesuit missionaries. There's a record of Father Isaac Hogues being captured in 1642 on his way south from Quebec. Their route led them through modern-day Glens Falls and along a trail to Wilton, where the trail turns towards the Mohawk River. In the early summer of 1646, a diplomatic mission was sent by the French into Mohawk territory, and again, Father Hogues was a member of that party. It was on this mission that he gave the name Lac du Saint-Sacrement to what we now know as Lake George. Small French and English settlements grew in the mid-1600s, but they were met with conflict over land. Moving into the 1700s, we continue to see this conflict over land claims between the French, English, and Native tribes primarily. These conflicts came to blows during the French and Indian War. People wanted to make more permanent settlements in this region, but the biggest barrier were those continued threats of attack over territory. Starting in 1755, we enter the French and Indian War period. Glens Falls was mostly wilderness at this time, with the exception of a portage trail and the occasional rude shelter that would be used by hunters or travelers. Under Colonial Army Major General William Johnson, the Army moved from Albany up the Hudson River late in July of 1755. They built a road as they marched, and they arrived in Fort Edward in early August. This road continued all the way up to Lake George, creating the first vital link in a chain of events that led to the settlement of this region. Part of this road would later become what we know as Route 9. Johnson made the journey up to Lac du Saint-Sacrement and renamed it Lake George in honor of the English king. The end of the French and Indian War in 1763, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, finally brought a sense of security to northern settlers and directly led to an increase in settlement in this region under the Queensbury Patent. So this is where we really begin, with the Queensbury Patent. The name Queensbury was chosen in honor of King George III's new queen, Charlotte. The patent presented the opportunity for one of the first settlements in northern New York in 1762. In 1763, Abraham Wing and Ichabod Merritt moved from Dutchess County and began to settle this land that they had dubbed a dense green wilderness. Fish and game were plentiful here at the time, including deer, American shad, beavers, elk, moose, catamounts, panthers, wolves, and rattlesnakes. Now, their intention was to establish a house, a tavern, and a sawmill at the falls because they were already looking to harness that water power. The land itself cost nothing, but the fees and expenses of surveys were fairly considerable. In 1764, the first sawmill was established. To put things in perspective, the land that is now New York City had been settled for 150 years by the time Wings Falls established its very first sawmill. On October 7th, 1765, 30 acres of land was deeded to Abraham Wing. The original hope was to establish a Quaker settlement that was modeled after the one in Quaker Hill, Dutchess County. The first town meeting wasn't held until May 1766, so it's difficult to note the conditions during those first initial settlement years. The first building erected was a log dwelling, and that was occupied by Abraham Wing and his family. A little bit of background on the town's founder. Abraham Wing was born in Dartmouth, Massachusetts on August 4th, 1721. He was a birthright Quaker, which simply meant that his parents were also Quakers. Abraham went on to become the largest landowner in Queensbury, credited with 11 township lots and parts of 2 others, amounting to some 3,000 acres. The first town hall meeting was held on May 6, 1766, where they selected officers. Abraham Wing was made moderator, supervisor, and overseer of the poor. Before long, we were entering the period of the American Revolution. Abraham Wing and other Quakers were adamantly against violence, and so they had no intention of fighting in the war. Their greatest fear was an invasion from the north that would push them from this newfound settlement. After the first year of the Revolution, Ticonderoga, Crown Point, Lake George, and Lake Champlain were under control of the Patriots, and Queensbury was really bracing for what would come next in 1776. The land was stripped for military use, even though there wasn't much military action in northern New York at this time, and this made things even more challenging for those early settlers. During the spring of 1776, a company of gentlemen stayed at Wing's Tavern overnight. This group included Samuel Chase, John and Charles Carroll, and Benjamin Franklin. And we know this because Charles Carroll documented this trip in his journal. Throughout the Revolutionary period, Abraham Wing remained the supervisor of Glens Falls from 1766 to 1778. Even though the violence of the Revolution pushed the Quaker settlers to withdraw to Dutchess County by 1780, most had returned after 3 years, and that settlement process resumed. In 1784, there's a surge of new settlers from Connecticut moving into this region as well. At the corner of what is now Glen and South Streets, the first frame house was built in 1784 by Abraham Haviland, who was a blacksmith. By 1785, there were 18 families living in Glens Falls. As settlement became more secure, they went on to build a grist mill and another sawmill. Glens Falls remained the name of the town until 1788, when popular Patriot officer Johannes Glenn was given the naming rights through one of 2 rumored ways. The first was that Colonel Johannes Glenn offered to pay the balance of a wine supper for the entertainment of a party of mutual friends, as long as Mr. Wing would agree to transfer claim and title to the name of the falls. The other story is that the naming rights were won in a card game, where Mr. Wing had placed them as a bet on the table. It's far more likely that the first scenario is true, but it's always fun to imagine the second as a possibility. Either way, Glens Falls became Glens Falls, and the apostrophe would later be dropped. In the time between the town being named Glens Falls and Glens Falls, the village was also called Pearl Village and Glenville, both very briefly. It was rumored in a notebook that the turn away from Glens Falls as a name was partially sparked by the unpopularity of Abe Wing during and immediately after the war. Because he was unwilling to fight in the American Revolution, most people didn't look at that favorably. As we moved into the 1800s, major changes began to happen here in Glens Falls. We're going to look more closely at a few of these industries, but some of the major players were paper, pulp, cement, lime, lumber, buckboards, brick, and textiles. To grease the wheels of these various industries, there needed to be an easier way to cross the Hudson River. So the first bridge to span the Hudson between South Glens Falls and Glens Falls was built in 1792, and it was barely wide enough for one wagon to cross. In 1803, the toll bridge was built. This bridge was up until 1833, and transportation at this point was either wagon or stagecoach. While stagecoaches make for a picturesque period in American transportation, it was far from a smooth ride. There was also an increase in the use of old military roads at this time. Now, these wouldn't have been considered good roads by today's standards, but they were maintained relatively well and were a major step forward in local transportation, especially since they connected Glens Falls with Fort Edward, Lake George, and others. As it was surveyed in 1805, State Road extended from Kingsbury through Queensbury, Warrensburg, and Chester, all the way to the Vermont state line. During this time period, we also see sawmills being constructed dating to 1807 and 1808. And by 1813, Warren County was established from land that was originally part of Washington County. Over the next century and a half, a total of 7 bridges would cross the span of the Hudson River over the spot we now know as Cooper's Cave. And at this point in 1826, Cooper's Cave was made internationally famous by the release of James Fenimore Cooper's novel, Last of the Mohicans. The next bridge to cross over was the Free Bridge, and that only stood for 9 years, from 1833 to 1842. When it was considered beyond repair, the covered bridge was built in 1842, and it stood until 1890. With the large sawmills on either side of the Hudson at this point, as well as the booming logging industry, the wooden trusses of the covered bridge were supporting heavy traffic. This is also when the recognizable stone arch was built with a picturesque view of the falls through it. It became a popular framing spot for local photographers, and the Glens Falls Insurance Company would go on to use the stone arch as their logo. In 1890, the iron bridge was built to replace the covered bridge in hopes that it would better support the weight of increased traffic. By 1903, heavy trolley cars weakened that stone bridgeway, and the arch was taken down. The iron bridge would have stood a bit longer, but it was unfortunately destroyed in 1913 by a record-making flood. During its time of use, however, the first Model T car was released, and it stood through the economic panic of '93, as well as the San Francisco earthquake. The destruction of the iron bridge drew quite a crowd. In March of 1913, it had rained for almost a week. There was no place for the runoff to go besides the river, and the melting snow was also a contributing factor. On March 21st, the river was running 16,400 cubic feet per second. By March 28th, this had risen to 84,200 cubic feet per second. Spectators watched the rushing water from land, trolley car trips across the bridge were suspended, and police were stationed at either end to warn pedestrians that crossing was at their own risk. There was one pedestrian who foolishly crossed moments before the bridge gave way and recounted that it was swaying dangerously the whole crossing. The bridge finally gave way as logs that came downriver battered against the trusses. By the morning of March 28th, the bridge was down. This wasn't the only flood that Glens Falls had suffered at this point, and so it was an issue that needed to be addressed. In 1922, the Hudson River Regulating District was created, and by 1930, the construction of the Conklingville Dam formed the Sacandaga Reservoir, which continues to regulate the river and prevent flooding, while still allowing for the hydroelectric power to continue to be harvested. Today, the water runs approximately 21,000 cubic feet per second. Following the catastrophic flood, the next bridge is often forgotten. The Loaned Bridge was only spanning the Hudson for 2 years, and it was too narrow for the trolley and another car to pass at the same time, so watchmen blocked other traffic as the trolley crossed. While it was only there for 2 years, major construction took place in Glens Falls during this time. It was at this point that the city was ready for a viaduct. For those of you who don't know, a viaduct is simply a longer bridge-like structure supported by a series of arches. The Queensbury-Moreau Viaduct opened in 1915 and welcomed a much more permanent solution to the bridge problem. A cement spiral staircase was also added so that people could walk down and view the now famous Cooper's Cave. By the 1940s and the popularization of the automobile, the 2 lanes of traffic simply weren't big enough. Increases in car travel led to standstills at traffic lights. Now in 1961, the bridge was rebuilt and the staircase was removed because it was crumbling and it had become a liability for the city. Between the opening of the Northway in the 1960s and the addition of 2 more lanes of traffic, as well as the pedestrian sidewalks, the traffic crossing the Hudson was alleviated. Now that we've covered the different bridges over time, we're going to jump back and talk about the different industries that were developing in Glens Falls. In the early 1800s, American transportation is really evolving and it's happening very quickly. The Canal Era began in the early 1820s as the Champlain and Erie canals were completed. The feeder canal here in Glens Falls would be finished in 1832. Canals provided the opportunity not only for new businesses to come to the village, but to connect with the industrial development that was happening in the Midwest at the time. The early industries springing up in Glens Falls were primarily lumber and lime, and these industries became heavily reliant on the use of the feeder canal. The canal transformed the area from a struggling hamlet into a thriving village. On May 2nd, 1831, it was noted that 100 people were now living in Glens Falls. This would rapidly grow, and it was recorded just 4 years later, on July 1st, 1835, that the town had grown to just over 1,000 inhabitants, according to the New York State Census. I know this may not seem like a lot, but as you'll see later, this region is going to experience significant growth in the mid-1800s. The feeder canal in Glens Falls was originally intended to do as the name suggests and feed more water into the Champlain Canal. In 1832, the canal was open to navigation and boats were able to dock along the lime and sawmills. The lime industry also began in 1832 after deposits of black marble and limestone along the river started to be quarried. This waterfront area of Glens Falls quickly became known as Under the Hill, and the canal system allowed the stone to be shipped to world markets. Glens Falls black marble was internationally known for its beauty and its workability, but the import of lower-priced Belgian and Italian marble ended up terminating local production in 1923. If you're looking to see a piece of the marble for yourself, a block was inscribed with New York Excelsior, and it's located at the 160-foot landing of the stairs leading to the top of the Washington Monument in DC. Quarrying of black marble resumed briefly during World War I when imports became unavailable, but without the market for it, it halted again after the war. In 1845, the canal was widened to allow for more than one boat to pass at a time, and this really launched industry downtown. By 1859, citizens were petitioning for improvements to the canal. They noticed there were leaks, narrow spots, sandbars, and low water to contend with, which was making navigation difficult. Glens Falls did experience a bit of a setback in 1864 when a massive fire burned 112 buildings, including most of the village center. But in a way, this allowed for the village to rebuild at a time of immense growth. In the years that followed, the fire didn't hinder the village's success. By 1880, the Glens Falls Republican reported that 85 canal boats were employed in Glens Falls alone. These boats were carrying 120 to 150 tons of cargo, and it took 1 week to make the trip to Albany and return. The trip to New York City and back took approximately 10 days. Boats would make about 22 trips each year, and the average price per ton of freight to Albany was 60 cents, and it cost about $1.10 for freight to New York. The annual earning of the fleet for outward bound freight was estimated to be more than $240,000, which is approximately $6.8 million today. The canal era wouldn't last forever, though. The invention of the automobile provided quicker transportation and quickly outmoded the canal boat. To this day, the feeder canal continues to deliver water to the Champlain Canal, but boats no longer chart its course. The last shipment from Glens Falls was a load of paper on the Finch Prine boat, the WWII Boise, and that was set out on October 25th, 1928. During the canal era, we also see the development of the plank road era. These roads consisted of log planks laid across heavy timbers above graded surfaces. These were originally financed privately, but their maintenance relied on tolls. The most important plank road ran from Glens Falls to Lake George. It was built in 1848, and thousands of summer visitors traveled this road up to Lake George. In 1912, when the plank road ended, the one-way toll was a whopping 12 cents for one horse and 24 cents for a team. Pretty quickly, the excitement over the canal was followed by the excitement over the railroad. As early as 1832, the Warren County Railroad Company was incorporated for the purpose of connecting the feeder canal with Lake George. But it wasn't until July 26, 1867, that the Glens Falls Railroad Company was incorporated to connect the village with Fort Edward. Built in 1869, the first station was on the north side of Maple Street. The opening of this line was really exciting, and the 11 passenger cars made 11 round trips between the two stops on its first day. All of these cars were filled to capacity for each trip. In 1882, this line was extended up to Lake George. The second station was added in 1897 at the northeast corner of Lawrence and Cooper Streets. This station was situated adjacent to the McMullen-Levens factory, and it played a major role in the success of the textile industry, which we'll talk more about later. The railway was a really exciting advancement, and many people rode the trains all day, or they would even take their lunches on board. Passenger service to Glens Falls ended on January 10th, 1958. Logging was one of the most important industries in Glens Falls, and this relied heavily on the use of the river, canal, and later the automobile. Glens Falls was the leader in lumber production from 1852 until 1860, and during this time, logs carpeted the Hudson River around the Big Bend. Logs would be chopped down in the winter. Men would stay in makeshift logging camps during the season and work very long days. Horses and oxen would pull sleds carrying logs close to the river so that they could be floated down in the spring. When the Hudson River was frozen in the winter, lumbermen could pile logs from shore to shore. Once spring arrived, the ice would melt and the river driving would begin. As the logs approached Glens Falls, they needed to be stopped and sorted. Early on, it was clear that a better system for holding the logs had to be built. And so in 1849, the Big Boom was built a few miles west of Glens Falls on the Big Bend of the Hudson. And this was to increase the capacity for holding and distributing logs. This allowed sawmills to increase their production. In 1864, the region's first paper mill was built in South Glens Falls, and it was named International Paper. By 1872, 60 different companies had logs floating down the river, with over 200 million logs riding down the Hudson. River drives ended in this region in 1950 when Finch Prine ran their last drive. In the early 1920s, the focus on sawmills and lumber transitioned to pulp and paper manufacturing. It was during this time that the Finch Prine newspaper print mill broke ground, and the original wing sawmill was dismantled, and the old grist and marble mills were raised for construction of the paper mill. By the 1920s, the cargo carried on the canal boats was largely newsprint for transportation to New York City. While the lumber industry resulted in a boom of wealth in this town, it also led to significant loss in local wilderness. As logging continued, loggers had to travel further north into the Adirondacks for harvestable material. Now that we've looked at some of the transportation changes and developments in industry, I'm going to shift gears to look at the other businesses that were significant in the village. In 1849, the Glens Falls Insurance Agency was founded, and it spread the name Glens Falls across the globe. Organized only a decade after the village was incorporated, it had branch offices across the United States. The Glens Falls Insurance Company was the third largest employer in the area, behind lumber and limestone. To keep up with the growing business, they constructed a new building. It was erected in 1890, and it cost $75,000. When the 1906 San Francisco earthquake hit, they were the first company to pay all of their claims in full. They didn't have very many claims because they're a New York insurance agency, but it earned them a positive reputation. It also gave them the nickname Old and Tried. In 1912, the sandstone building was literally moved by horsepower, and the iconic marble building replaced it. In 1970, it was absorbed by the Continental Insurance Company, and by 1976, the building had been razed. The sandstone arch that adorned the second building and read "Old and Tried" was often a joke that it actually read "Old and Tired." Another major employer in town was the textile industry. In 1876, the Glens Falls Shirt Company opened with the Empire Shirt Company and Joseph Fowler Shirt Company not far behind by 1879. One of the largest manufacturers didn't open until 1902, and that was the McMullen-Levins Company. Founded by J.R. McMullen and Walter Levins, these entrepreneurs were jumping on an already rising industry in Glens Falls. Between 1860 and 1910, there were 20 textile mills making shirts, collars, lace, and ready-made clothing in this area, with B.B. Fowler being the first store to introduce a line of ready-to-wear women's clothing. B.B. Fowler was also one of the first buildings in the city to have gas lamps and an elevator. At this time, we also see a population increase as people move to the city for work, including immigrants from Canada, Ireland, Italy, and Germany primarily. Many Irish immigrant women found work at the McMullen-Levins Company. The 1880 village population was 4,900, and this rises to an impressive 15,243 over the next 30 years. Situated directly on the railroad, the McMullen-Levins Company was immensely successful and was a large employer in the city for many years, especially of women. As I'm sure many of you have driven past, the stately home across from the YMCA on Upper Glen Street was built by J.R. McMullen, and it served as his home when he was in Glens Falls. All of these changes in industry led to population growth and also the growth of cultural attractions. In 1868, the Warren County Fairgrounds were moved to Glens Falls by the Glens Falls Citizen Association after the purchase of land between what is now Lincoln and Horicon Avenues. An oval half-mile track was built, and a spacious grandstand that could seat 2,000 people was added. The county fair continued in this spot until 1895, when Arthur Sherman and R.A. Little bought the property and laid out the residential area that exists today. When the fairgrounds and the half-mile track closed, the Northern New York Horse Breeders Association bought 100 acres of land west of the old fairgrounds and Kensington Road. There, they laid out the east to west mile track, which was later labeled by horsemen as the fastest track in the country. The mile track in Glens Falls often gets overshadowed by the track in Saratoga, but in its 7 years of operation, nearly every notable horse raced it. From 1895 to 1902, spectators rode the trolley and watched races from the grandstand. Today, the only evidence of the track's existence lies in the curve of the road at the intersection of Horicon Avenue. In addition to the track, the Glens Falls Opera House opened in 1871, the Empire Theater opened in 1899, the 1874 City Directory boasted a total of 22 hotels in the village, and by 1909, you could see a movie at the World in Motion Theater for just 5 cents. One of those 22 hotels was the Rockwell House, situated where Hudson Avenue now connects to the traffic circle. It was constructed in 1872, and many major events took place at the Rockwell House, including the 1900 New York State Convention of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. The speakers were Addison Colvin, Mary Anthony, and Carrie Chapman Catt. This wasn't the first time that Glens Falls was used to aid in women's suffrage. In 1894, the Warren County Women's Suffrage Group met at the First Baptist Church on Maple Street, and their speaker was Susan B. Anthony. So impressed by the turnout, she was the one who asked for the convention to be held in Glens Falls in 1900. At this point in time, Warren County actually opposed suffrage, but Washington County and the city of Glens Falls were in favor. Unfortunately, many of these cultural attractions burned in catastrophic fires or were razed during the years of urban renewal. While Glens Falls was incorporated as a village in 1839, it wouldn't be until March 13th, 1908, that it was incorporated as a city. Citizens were worried that the charter was signed on Friday the 13th, but it was quickly forgotten once the celebration began. By the end of the 19th century, Glens Falls was one of the wealthiest and most populated villages in New York State, which is why it was finally incorporated as a city. The city charter was signed by Glens Falls native Governor Charles Evans Hughes, who would then go on to become a Supreme Court justice. Technically, this incorporation resulted in a loss of population because the designated city limits were quite small, and more people actually resided in the town of Queensbury than the city of Glens Falls. Nonetheless, the citizens of Glens Falls celebrated, and the fortunes of the residents of Glens Falls were spent on large private homes, education, civic organizations, and leisure time activities. There were many people who contributed to making Glens Falls what it is today, but so few contributed to the scale that Henry Crandall did. He was born in Lake George in 1821 to a family of very little means. At the age of 29, he came to Glens Falls with $1,000 to invest in real estate and lumber. Crandall went on to make a fortune in the lumber business. He and his wife didn't have children, so Crandall invested deeply in his community. He used the second floor of his business to establish a free library for anyone near and far to use. Additionally, when the village of Glens Falls decided to build a park, Crandall said, "No, I'll give you a park." He would actually donate the land for two parks, City Park and Crandall Park. Crandall also established a boys' savings club, encouraging 100 boys who signed up more financial assistance and guidance than he was given growing up. Crandall died in 1913, and he was buried in Crandall Park beneath a tall granite monument that his five-pointed star log mark sits atop. Legend has it that his two gray horses are buried with him and his wife, but to my knowledge, that remains unconfirmed. In the years that followed Glens Falls becoming a city, industry and new developments continued. During World War II is when Glens Falls officially became known as Hometown USA. Look magazine came to town to take photos and found that the city was an ideal model of the home front during the war. Citizens of Glens Falls attempted to help the war effort in many ways, and in 1942, there was even a massive salvage pile directly next to City Hall, where nearly 400 tons of metal was contributed to the war effort. Having experienced so much regional growth, the citizens of Warren County were seeking a community college as early as 1953. By 1958, the Action Committee of Warren and Washington County citizens was established, and a budget of $225,000 was set, and the name of Adirondack Community College was selected. On September 12, 1961, the college opened in the former Griffin Lumber Company building on Upper Broadway in Fort Edward, and a gift of 141 acres by the Glens Falls Insurance Company was accepted in 1967, and the college was moved to its new campus in Queensbury. The photo on the left is from the first meeting of the Board of Trustees in 1967. After the completion of the Northway in the 1960s, more people left the city limits to live in the town of Queensbury. We see this represented in the census data as the population of Glens Falls drops from 18,580 in 1960 to 17,222 in 1970. And it continues to drop in 1980. By 1970, Queensbury had surpassed Glens Falls in terms of population. In addition to the many changes that we've discussed, there were countless others that we simply don't have enough time to cover in one talk. This includes the establishment of the public education system, the variety of churches and different religions practiced, the construction of the Civil War Monument, the manufacture of the famous Joubert and White carriage buckboards, or the variety of businesses that once called Glen Street home. As of the 2020 census, the city of Glens Falls is currently home to just over 14,000 residents, with countless thriving businesses, some of which have been in business for more than 100 years and will continue to be for many more.